Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the introduction of version 8 of the many-to-many train system. If you've been around before, you know the drill. In the description of this video you will find the link to the blueprints, and you will find the changelog in the description as well. I am going to answer the questions of why I made the system, why you might want to use it, and also the highlights of version 8, a couple changes from version 7. After that, I'm going to the next video is going to be about how to use the blueprints, and the video after that will be about updating from previous versions to version 8. And finally, generally speaking, I expect that version 8 is the final version of this train system. Factorio has seen its official release with version 1 and so on. And unless they add more functions to the train system or the combinators or whatever, that might result in my refactoring everything again. Not much should change anymore, and there shouldn't be a version 9. I'm pretty sure that version 8 is going to be the last one. Alright, so why did I even make this? Like most people, I started with main bus bases, and there you go, now it works. Main bus bases are nice and tidy, and also kind of boring after a while if you've done them often enough. These days I only use main bus bases in the original bootstrap base, which I then use to branch out into outposts, and I switch to Railtown maps, Railtown playstyle right after basically the initial bootstrap base, after I've gotten all the unlocks. So my science over here, for example, gets me all the way to white science, and after that I'm done with playing main bus bases, right? Now Railtown means that you build every single item in the game in its own outpost, which means you have hundreds of outposts, and the real challenge essentially comes from train logistics, especially if you start to scale up your science production, 1,000 science per minute and so on and so up. You get a lot of traffic, and handling all of that in a smart and efficient way is quite fun, and that's why I do Railtown maps. Of course, if you have hundreds of outposts and more, you want a system that can support building hundreds of outposts fairly easily, fairly quickly. And a lot of players use dedicated builder trains, and not just that, they go into the train and they reserve slots via the middle click, right? I didn't want to do that, first of all, because I have RSI, so all this clicking in 40 slots for 4 wagons and for multiple trains is a bit much, and secondary, I found it a bit boring doing it that way. I prefer to have a more fluid system, more dynamic system, where I can simply tell the train how many to load of what, and then have that delivered to whatever outpost I'm creating or working at. And that's how I started building version after version after version of the many-to-many system with the player's depot, which you can see on the screen here, as well as individual outposts, such as this one. And to go directly into the question of why might you even want to use the system. So it consists of, you could say, 2 parts in generally speaking. It consists of the player's depot and the outposts, which are the parts that you interact with directly most of the time. The player's depot supplies the outpost, and the outpost basically supplies you with the materials you need to build more stations, as well as whatever factory you decide to build in your outpost, right? The player's depot is split into 2 parts. On the left, we have the building train supply. This is where you send the loadout that you want to, and on the right side we have the maintenance part. Once you set it up, it's essentially entirely automatic and you don't need to interact with this basically ever. And the same is also true for the various outposts. We have on the left side the part where the builder train comes to and unloads its building materials, which are used to, for example, build this outpost or build stations or build some little factories or defensive walls maybe, right? And on the right side we have the maintenance part. The train for this is unique to every station. Every outpost has one train, has some artillery, and it has 2 wagons for well, whatever you considered maintenance to be, right? It could be very simple setups that contain just a couple repair packs, a couple bots, a little bit of fuel, that kind of stuff, right? Or it could be enough to sustain an entire defensive wall, as I have in this outpost. Or maybe you need to supply miners and what are they called? Productivity modules, right? That kind of stuff finds its home in the maintenance part. The train, for example, here is automatically sent back to the depot whenever it runs out of materials. And the system itself is also self-maintaining, which means that if you change the loadout, whatever is now superfluous actually does get recycled back into the train and then shipped back home to the depot. So you don't have waste lying around in various inventories. And the way my train system works essentially is, as I said earlier, every outpost has its own train. Every train is dedicated to that outpost. It logs itself into the circuitry, and the circuitry can only remember the first train that arrives at the station, right? So in the blueprint, as you can see here, there's a train right on the right side. This is the train that saves itself into the circuitry. And the outposts, maintenance unload stations, they stay off until the train that belongs to them goes into the depot, at which point the information of what train it is gets sent over the global network along the rails to each outpost, and if it is the correct train, that outpost will turn itself on. And in that way I can basically ensure that, generally speaking, trains do not go to the wrong outpost because, well, all the other outposts are disabled, right? Okay. And on the left side we have, or on both sides you have these remotes which you can use. So on the right side, the maintenance part, basically this is where you tell the depot what to load on the train. And on the left side, this is what you tell the depot to load on the builder train. You have a couple switches which you can use to send the loadout and to order trains to be sent to you or to this outpost. And you have a couple switches to turn the outpost on or off, to determine whether or not a train will be allowed to leave after it has been unloaded or loaded or it simply has arrived here. And you can, of course, tell the inserters what to do. Load the train, unload the train, or do nothing at all, which is, for example, handy if you're preparing a loadout for the next outpost and you don't want it to be unloaded here. And then there's also a trash cycle, which automatically orders empty trains. They get loaded with all the stuff in the inventory, and once the inventory is empty, the trash cycle disables itself and turns the station off, which basically makes management easy. You build your factories here, you build your stations, I don't know, if you're mining or something. And once you're done and you want to make sure that all your materials come back to the base so that you can use them when you're building another outpost, you simply engage the trash cycle. And the rest will be taken care of automatically. So that's basically the first half or the first 2/3 of my system. And the other part is the resource stations. I have resource stations for solids, loading, unloading, and for fluids. And I have train yards for both solids and fluids. And basically the way my resource system works is that you, instead of dedicating trains to stations, you dedicate trains to resources. For example, I have a bunch of train yards at this point. This one is dedicated to landfill, this one is dedicated to stone brick, stone, copper plates, copper, and so on. You get the idea, right? My stations are all called the same thing. For example, here I have copper unload. All stations that unload copper are called copper unload, right? They're all the same. You can see here, I have another one of these. And the trains choose whichever one still has slots free to go to. Recently, in one of the Factorio versions of a couple months ago, the devs added the ability for train stations to have slots open that can be reserved by trains. And that allowed me to significantly simplify my system. I didn't have to do quite as many workarounds anymore, but now I also have fixed train yards. So these are now mandatory. Previously they were just if you wanted to have them for management purposes. Now they are mandatory because the train yard effectively are what managed the sending and receiving of trains. So if I have a station that needs or could serve, let's say, 5 trains, it sends that information over the global network to the train yard or to all train yards, and the train yards check whether or not the resource that is required is the one that they serve, and if they do, then they say, okay, I need this many full trains, I need this many empty trains to be dispatched. It releases those trains, and the trains go to whatever the closest station is that still has a slot open. And if you have enough trains, which you should, so in this system basically requires that you have enough trains to meet the demand. That way you can ensure that every station that needs trains gets trains. And finally, I think that's it for an overview. Not much more to say. So what's changed since version 7? If you were here previously in version 7, then you might remember that the highlight of version 7 was essentially that rework of the resource stations. I didn't touch the depot, I didn't touch the outposts, or not much, a little bit towards the end while I was preparing for version 8. But essentially version 7 was all about updating resource stations, and version 8 is actually about the depot, the outposts. And you'll see that the remotes have changed a little bit. They look a little bit differently now. They have more functions than previously. And at the same time, I've also gotten rid of some extraneous stuff. For example, I used to have, I think it was 9 or 10, or was it even 12 slots for more wagons. But really only 4 makes sense because my trains are only 4 big, right? There was some edge cases where the old remotes could get stuck either in endless circles, or rather if multiple remotes needed to do the same thing in the same tick. For example, if I engaged multiple trash cycles in the same tick, either after pausing the game or by using the global switch, which is also new, which I'll talk about in a second. Sometimes the remotes would, mess each other up, and I've gotten rid of that in this version. That's of course a new thing. It wasn't a problem previously in previous versions unless you'd build a lot of outposts in quick succession, which only would have happened if you needed to update all of them and you just deleted all of them and then printed them from the map real quick. And yeah, you might have run into some edge case issues there. I've gotten rid of those. The loading and unloading of the train itself hasn't changed, the circuitry I mean. This has pretty much stayed the same because I don't think you can go much smaller than this without some changes to inserters that I would need from Whoop to be able to go do with less combinators. I'm not going to say there's no way to optimize this or to make the footprint a couple combinators smaller, but I haven't found it. I did improve the train dispatch circuitry. It works smoother now. It handles all the edge cases as far as I can see, as far as I've tried. I haven't gotten a single train stuck anymore. Yeah, so there's not much more to say about this. There's been some redesigning in the base. I've gotten rid of the item provider and the virtual signal provider because the virtual signal provider is completely useless so far. It still exists as a blueprint, but I haven't had any use out of it. And the item provider has moved into the middle here for symmetry reasons. The tracker here has changed slightly, so one of the user errors that occasionally pops up is that if you forget to enable the dispatch for artillery trains, they'll of course get stuck in the depot and not leave. And you might wonder why that is until you eventually realize that you didn't actually see that you didn't actually turn the switch or enable train dispatch for the maintenance side. So that's a new alarm here. And finally, one last remaining edge case that I've managed to delegate so far to the edge. I think that it shouldn't be happening anymore, but just in case, because it is the last thing that can mess you up as far as I'm aware, and that I can't really fix efficiently, is this combinator right here. So the way my remotes work is that they use collision detection, and that means that if multiple remotes try to send information in the same tick, that's a collision, which means that my remotes are set up in such a way that they try to send or resend that information after a random delay, or pseudo kinda sorta random delay. And the way I create this randomness is by basically turning all the information on the global network that this remote has seen into a number. I simply add them up. And that information I use to then divide with a modulo, and the modulo, the remainder of that division, becomes the delay in ticks until the system is allowed to return to try and resend the information again. And that basically creates random delays. So even if two remotes or more remotes send the same, try to send information in the same tick, the delay of them to resend the information is going to be different, right? Now, if this difference in delay is created by these remotes tracking what's on the global network, both on the red and green wire, then of course what happens is if you print two remotes at the same time between transmissions, they end up with exactly the same number in this combinator, exactly the same delay. And that won't fix itself automatically. You would have to basically have to remove the short circuit here of one of them and then put it back on again, and this would then be reset to 0, and the other would then have the difference, right? You wouldn't have both remotes stuck on the same run anymore. This was in normal play not an issue because you're not creating outposts after outpost after outpost in such a short time within seconds of each other. But it is an issue if you're, for example, replacing a lot of outposts really quick. So for example, I have no more outposts in here because I'm updating, right? So this is something that I'm going to do in the next video. I'm going to show you how to update using these outposts over here. And if I replace all of them by just taking the blueprint and going onto the map and then printing here, god damn it, train, station, printing here, here, and here, then the bots might actually manage to build these remotes directly after each other within a span of time that would not allow messages to have occurred on the global network. So the combinators might actually all end up saving the same number, right, unintentionally, and then those remotes could get stuck on each other because they'd have the same number and they might end up in an endless loop. And this is the only way that I can find where this system could still mess itself up and get stuck in an endless loop. And you break that by breaking this connection and then rewiring it. I have fixed that edge case in such a way that I've created a quick loop over here that basically, so when a remote is created, it adds 1 R to the global network. Right now you can see I have 32 remotes. If I build another remote, that R value will rise to 33, and that in turn will cause these two combinators here to send a signal over the global network. And so that basically creates immediately, when a remote has been created, immediately creates that message that causes that remote to already increment upwards from the default value, right? The default value is 0 in this case, but you get the idea. So theoretically, you should never get into a situation where one remote and another remote have the same number because of this thing. But theoretically isn't good enough, not 100%, because sometimes you might have bots just place two remotes in such an unlucky way that the same thing as I mentioned earlier happens again. And that's why I have another system down here. Once per minute, an update is sent over the global network, and these two together should, and they have in my experience, I've tried this with more than 20 by printing them down. I've printed over 20 of these outposts, and it has worked properly every time I tried. I've tried with I don't know, 30, 40 outposts on an editor map. So I haven't, since I've done this combination of this and this once per minute update, it has worked beautifully, and I've not seen it anymore. But theoretically it could still happen. So if you see a remote hung up, endlessly stuck, and these lamps are endlessly flashing yellow or whatever, and it doesn't seem to be stopping, then the right thing to do would be to go and kill this combinator and then reattach the wire, and you'd be done. Alright, that's a bit of a departure from what has changed, but that's basically the biggest update, the remotes and the entire refactoring of the circuits in the outposts. So as you can see, it looks a little bit cleaner now, and it's divided into modules. So if you want to take a look at the circuitry and start understanding what I'm doing here, you can basically go through it module by module. So this combinator is your legend of what each module does. For example, this one reads the switches, this one reads the constant combinators here, this is the trash cycle, right? And over here again, the first line reads the switches, this line takes care of the train ID. So if I mouse over this train, I can see on the right side train ID 5189. That is the unique ID that only this train has, and that is the ID that is saved into this combinator. And basically all of this takes care of handling this ID properly and what the ID is used for, stuff like that, right? Then over here we have inventory management. That takes care of what's present in the outpost and what needs to be trashed and recycled. Then we have the management of whether or not the station needs to be turned on or off. And finally, whether or not the train needs to go and get itself restocked. And if you're wondering what are these combinators doing here, right? These are wire pins. They themselves don't do anything except hold and guide the wire so it doesn't look quite as terrible as just directly connecting wires left and right and across and whatever. And other than that, everything's still the same, except I have also a switch over here that allows you to immediately delete the memory of that ID. So if the wrong train comes in here first of all and logs itself into circuitry, even though the train is already remembered in another station, you can use this switch to delete the memory. The other two switches still do the same. This one forces the station to be turned on if the train is not present, and this one forces the train to leave. And over here, same story as before as well. Turn the station on or off, tell the train to leave or not, and inserter control trash cycle. Right. Oh yeah, I've removed the display down here that told you how many items you have in the station because it just simply seemed like a waste of space. The information it gave me never had any value to me, so I decided I would do without the combinators. Generally speaking, I have been able to save a bunch of combinators. And that has also allowed me to actually conflate step 1 and step 2 of the outpost. Now it's just one. It's still a little bit more now than the original step 1. Of course it is, because I don't just have the left side anymore, or not even just part of the left side, I also have the entire right side now. So there's a slight cost to the amount of rails and rail signals and stuff like that you can bring with you to build the first step of the outpost. But in the end, I never ran into any troubles anyway. Either that or I didn't. Basically, the difference is so small that chances are that if you had to go back with the new train, you also would have had to go back with the old train, even though it had more rails and stuff. The difference wasn't that big. So I figured this is less chore. All right. I've also at some point gotten rid of the smaller version of the depot. I've not heard of anybody use it. I've not used it myself. I always use the spacious version, and I figure that maintaining the compact version is just a waste of my time and resources. So I just stick with this one. Also, another change I did in the depot is the global switches. I wanted a way to basically force all outposts setup stations, those are the ones on the left side where your builder train goes to, force them all to be turned off. And I also wanted to automatically be able to engage, or automatically, I mean, I wanted to be able to engage the trash cycle for all stations at the same time, without having to go through them one by one, just a global switch here. And on the right side, these you probably won't use much. This one allows you to force all artillery trains to leave the outpost and come back to restock at the same time. And this one is to delete the memory of all outposts at the same time. I generally suggest you do not use this, because this is going to cause a major traffic jam, depending on how many outposts you have, right? This is just kind of last resort kind of thing, and maybe, frankly speaking, these are not much use. They're more trouble than they're worth, I think. But it's not like they're completely... Not much use is not no use. So I just keep them around also because of symmetry. Right. I've also moved the Outpost setup dummy stations from over here and multiplied them by 4. The reason for that is very simple. What sometimes happened with the trash cycle was that if you had, let's say, 4 trains going to a station to empty it out, the first train already succeeds, and the station turns itself off, the trash cycle finishes, and the one train goes back to the base and it's done. The other 3 trains are still stuck on Outpost setup in the schedule, and either they need an Outpost setup dummy station that they can go to, so they don't know pass in the middle of the rails or near some other outpost. And B, not just that, but also the issue is, of course, that even if I have an outpost station in the depot over here, the 3 trains that are stuck in the stacker while the fourth train that was successful is finished, those 3 trains can't actually go and update the schedule back to the default state of wanting to go to the player's depot to get stocked with whatever you want the train to have, right? Because A, there's only one, and B, the trains can't actually get here while there's still a train in the station. So they'd basically be stuck here, and now I go and turn another outpost on, and all of a sudden I have 3 trains going to the new outpost without the correct load. Of course, the train that has the correct load will also go eventually, but it might be the last to leave, right? Depending on whether or not I just changed the loadout, and so it would need to load. By adding these 4 outpost setups dummy stations over here, I can ensure that any train that comes back here actually completely finishes its schedule and goes back to player's depot. And that way I can avoid having the wave of 3 empty or trash loaded trains driving to the new outpost, right? Alright. Is that actually it? I think that's actually it for the updates. Again, you will find the link to the blueprints in the description as well as a changelog. And I think I have no more to say. I'm also releasing a grid over here that has basically been adapted to... Oh, right. I almost forgot. Yeah, I'm gonna mention that in a moment. So the grid is the one I use over here. Basically, right, you can see here a little bit of a grid. You can see it on the map even better. The grid, this is adapted to work with Player's Depot and with the rail system. It is also chunk aligned just like the rail system. And speaking of the rail system, I use Elder Access chunk aligned right-hand drive rail network. I think it is the best one that I've come across. Right? And the trademark of this, basically, as well as others like it, is that they use chunks to line themselves on the map. And the idea, of course, with that is that regardless of where you start, if you always have the same offset to each chunk, even if you start in 2 different places, you can connect the system into one whole easily without having to do any weird sideways jumps and adjustments or something, right? And this one uses the power poles as the center, and I like that so much that I decided that I would make my train system compatible with Elder Access. I've done a few minor changes, nothing big, so it's basically still original. And if you do not like right-hand drive rail systems, or you don't use Elder Access, you want to stick with another one, you can easily adjust my blueprints to your rail system. You'll basically just have to go in and switch out this upper part, for example, right? That kind of stuff. And you can also, of course, make the trains come in from the other side, but that'll just require resignaling. It's not difficult, it's just I'm not going to do it because I only do right-hand drive. So you can do it. It's not a big thing, but you're gonna have to do it yourself. All right. Thank you for watching.